She raised a lion cub 10 years ago. What happened when he saw her again was unbelievable. The lion shouldn't have looked at her the way he did. Not after 10 years. Not after everything wild animals are supposed to forget. Margaret Ellison was 53 years old, a retired wildlife rehabilitation specialist from Johannesburg, and she had spent the last decade convincing herself that what happened in that rescue tent in 2014 hadn't meant anything. Not to him, anyway. Cubs don't carry memory like that. The science doesn't support it. She'd told herself that so many times it had stopped feeling like a lie. She almost didn't come back to Limpopo at all. Her daughter had booked the trip as a birthday gift, a private reserve tour, 3 days, the kind of trip that felt safe and curated and completely removed from the rawness of fieldwork. You need to stop living in your head, Mom. That's what Nadia had said. Go see the animals you spent your life saving. Just watch them, from a vehicle, like a normal person. Margaret had laughed. She'd packed light. She'd promised herself she wouldn't think about him. The reserve covered 47,000 acres of dry savanna, broken by riverbeds and low acacia clusters. Her guide, a tall Shangaan man named Elias Mabunda, had been working the area for 11 years. He knew the terrain the way other people know their own kitchen. Without thinking, without looking down, he was the one who mentioned the lion on the first morning. Big male, northern sector, very established. Elias adjusted his hat and studied the horizon. The rangers call him Scar, shoulder marking, old wound, healed clean. He's been dominant in that coalition for 3 years. Margaret said nothing. You'll probably see him, Elias added. He moves during morning hours. Likes the eastern ridge. She looked out across the dry grass and felt something she hadn't expected. Not excitement, not nostalgia. Something closer to dread. She had found him in July of 2014, 3 days after his mother was killed by a snare. He was maybe 6 weeks old, barely mobile, screaming with a sound that didn't belong to anything that small. She'd lifted him herself, carried him in a towel that still smelled like the field. For 4 months, she was the first voice he heard every morning, the first scent at feeding time. His nervous system, still forming, still deciding what was safe and what wasn't, had encoded her alongside warmth and food and the absence of pain. She knew the science. She'd written reports on it. Imprinting isn't love, it's pattern. It's survival architecture. She'd repeated that to herself for 10 years. On the second afternoon, the Land Cruiser's engine coughed twice and died. The silence that followed was total. Elias turned the ignition. Nothing. He tried again, jaw tight, and the engine made a sound like something giving up. Radio? Margaret asked. He checked. His expression answered before he did. She stepped down from the vehicle without thinking. Instinct, habit, the body choosing before the mind agreed, and stood beside the dusty door in the full afternoon heat. The grass to the north was still. Then it moved. He emerged slowly, not like a predator closing distance, like something that had already decided. The sun caught the scar on his left shoulder. Pale, diagonal, unmistakable. Elias went absolutely rigid. Margaret felt her hands begin to shake. 10 years. Could he possibly? She stopped herself. No, of course not. Could he? She had rehearsed this moment without knowing it. Not consciously, she hadn't stood in front of a mirror whispering a dead cub's name into the dark. But somewhere in the years between then and now, her body had been preparing. The way the breath leaves. The way the feet stay planted when every nerve is screaming to run. The way the hands almost involuntarily go still. Margaret stood beside the Land Cruiser and did not move. Elias was behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing through his nose. Slow, deliberate, the trained breath of a man managing fear rather than feeling it. His hand was resting near the door handle. Not a weapon, not a radio, just something solid to hold. The lion walked without urgency. That was the first thing that registered. Not the size of him, though he was enormous, well over 400 pounds. The kind of mass that reorganizes your understanding of a landscape. Not the scar, though her eyes went there immediately and stayed. What registered first was the pace. A territorial male approaching an unknown vehicle in his range moves with intention. Warning. This was different. He moved the way water moves, not toward them exactly, but in their direction, as if pulled by something slow and inevitable. He stopped at 30 meters. Elias exhaled once, quietly, and said nothing. The lion's eyes were amber, pale at the center, and they moved across Elias without stopping. Then they found Margaret, and they stopped. She felt it in her chest before she understood it. That specific quality of being seen by something that doesn't see the way humans see, not assessed, not targeted, something older than that. His nostrils flared twice rhythmically, reading the air with the patience of an animal that has never once needed to rush. His head tilted left. She knew that movement. She had seen it in a 6-week-old cub who heard her footsteps approaching his enclosure and turned toward the sound before she opened the door. The same angle, the same stillness that followed. Her throat tightened. "Don't speak," Elias said, barely audible. She wasn't going to speak. She couldn't have if she'd tried. Her mouth was dry and her heart was somewhere in her ears, and the rational part of her brain, the part that had written peer-reviewed papers on associative memory and juvenile felids, was running every counter-argument it had. 10 years is beyond reliable recall in most documented cases. Olfactory memory can persist, but requires reactivation through proximity. Behavioral recognition is not emotional recognition. The lion took 3 steps forward, 25 meters now, close enough that she could see the texture of the scar tissue, close enough to see him breathe. He chuffed. It was low, almost inaudible, a soft, percussive exhale through the nose, the kind of sound that has no aggression in it. Researchers call it Proustin in some big cats, a contact call, a non-threatening vocalization used between animals that recognize each other as safe. Margaret had heard it once before, from a cub at 4 months old, the last morning she fed him before the reintroduction team arrived. She pressed her fingers against the side of the vehicle to keep herself upright. Behind her, Elias had gone completely silent. She could feel him trying to make sense of what he was watching. This animal, who had never once approached a stalled vehicle without aggression or indifference, standing 25 meters away making contact sounds at a stranger. Except she wasn't a stranger. That was the thing her brain kept arriving at and then retreating from, because it was too large to hold comfortably. She wasn't a stranger to him. The question was whether that meant anything at all, or whether it meant everything. The engine wasn't going to start. Elias had known it the moment the ignition failed the second time. Something in the fuel line. Or worse, the alternator. He'd seen it before in vehicles that sat too long between services. The reserve's maintenance schedule had been slipping since the dry season started, and 3 of their mechanics had left for better contracts in Kruger. He knew all of this in the background of his mind, while the foreground was entirely occupied by the lion standing 20 meters from a woman who hadn't run. He needed to think. He couldn't think. "Stay exactly where you are," he said, so quietly it barely qualified as speech. Margaret didn't answer. She was looking at the lion the way people look at something they've lost and found again, not with happiness exactly, but with that particular kind of disbelief that sits just in front of it. Elias had guided for 11 years. He had been charged by elephants, bluff charged by hippos, had once spent 4 hours on top of a Land Cruiser waiting for a leopard to lose interest in the front tire. He was not an easily frightened man, but what he was watching now had no category in his experience. Scar. And it was absolutely Scar. The scar was unmistakable. He'd photographed that marking 40 times, was behaving in a way that had no precedent in 11 years of observation. The lion took 2 more steps, 15 meters. Elias felt his hand tighten on the door handle. At this distance on foot with no radio and no engine, the mathematics were simple and terrible. A male lion at full charge covers ground faster than a human mind can process it. There is no running. There is no negotiating. There is only what the animal decides. Scar was not deciding to charge. He was standing with his weight distributed evenly, tail low, ears forward. Not pinned, not flattened, forward. Curious. The body language of an animal that is interested rather than threatened. Elias had seen that posture in younger lions approaching unfamiliar objects, never in a dominant male approaching humans on foot. Then Margaret spoke. She said a name. It was barely a whisper, and Elias didn't catch it fully. Something short, 2 syllables, the kind of name you give something small and young and not yet dangerous. She said it the way you say the name of someone you're not sure is still in the room. The lion's ear moved. Just the left one. A single rotation toward the sound. Precise and involuntary. The way an ear moves when it recognizes something before the rest of the brain has caught up. Elias stopped breathing. The lion stood still for a long moment, and the savannah stood still with him. A red-billed oxpecker called once from somewhere in the acacias, and then went quiet, as if it too understood that something was happening that required silence. Then Scar began to move again, not toward them directly, slightly to the left, a wide, unhurried arc that took him around the front of the vehicle. Elias tracked him with his eyes without turning his head, watching the line of the lion's shoulders, reading the muscle beneath the coat, waiting for the shift that would tell him what was coming. It didn't come. Scar completed the arc and arrived at Margaret's side of the vehicle. He was close enough now that Elias could hear him breathing, slow, even, the deep respiratory rhythm of an animal entirely at rest. 430 pounds of apex predator standing close enough to touch, and the sound coming from him was the sound of something that had simply come to a place it recognized. Margaret had not moved. Her hands were flat against the door panel, fingers spread, and Elias could see from the set of her shoulders that she was shaking, not violently, the fine interior tremor of someone managing something enormous from the inside. The lion lowered his head and pressed the side of his face against the vehicle just above her hand. Elias had seen facial marking behavior hundreds of times. Lions rub their faces against trees, rocks, termite mounds, the flanks of other lions they know. It deposits scent. It signals familiarity. It is the physical language of I have been here before and this is mine. Not territorial in the aggressive sense, but in the intimate one. He had never seen a lion do it to a car door. He had never seen a lion do it 6 inches above a human hand. The sound that came from Scar in that moment was low and resonant. Something felt more than heard, and Margaret made a sound too. Barely anything. Just an exhale that had too much in it. A decade of it. Elias realized his mouth was open. He closed it. He looked at the woman standing beside the vehicle with a 400-pound lion pressed gently against the door above her fingers, and he thought about all the things he would say later when people asked him what he'd seen. And he understood already that none of those words were going to be adequate. The lion stayed. The afternoon light moved across the grass and the shadows lengthened, and Scar remained exactly where he was, breathing slowly, in no hurry at all, as if he had simply been waiting for her to come back. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Elias would think about the silence later, not as absence, but as texture. The way the air felt during those minutes when the lion stayed beside the vehicle and the afternoon burned slowly around them. He had spent 11 years in the bush learning to read silence the way other people read faces, and this silence had something in it he didn't have a word for. Scar sat down. Not immediately. First he stood for another minute or two, head still low, breathing against the door panel. Then, gradually, with the unhurried weight of something that has decided the situation no longer requires alertness, he folded himself down onto the ground. Front legs first, then the haunches, the full mass of him settling into the red dirt beside the rear wheel. The way he sat was not the crouch of an animal at rest between movements. It was the loose, sideways lean of a lion that is genuinely, completely calm. Elias had seen Scar from a distance dozens of times over 3 years. He had video footage of this lion chasing a rival male out of the northern sector, with a ferocity that had made his trainee guide physically recoil from the camera screen. He had a photograph of Scar standing over a buffalo kill with blood on his chest, and his eyes flat with something ancient and absolute. The animal sitting in the dirt beside Margaret Ellison's hand did not look like that lion. It looked like a version of that lion that existed before all of it, before the dominance, before the territory, before the years of surviving things that shaped him into what he was now. It looked in a way Elias couldn't entirely explain and didn't try to, like something remembered. Margaret had stopped shaking. That was the thing Elias kept returning to afterward. She had stopped shaking. Not gradually, the way fear dissipates when danger passes, but at a specific moment, when the lion sat down, when the intention became clear, she had simply gone still, as if some calculation her body had been running for 10 years had finally resolved. She was looking down at him, not making eye contact. She knew better than that, and the instinct was still there even through everything else, but looking at the shape of him, the scar, the slow rise and fall of his ribs. He was so small, she said. She wasn't talking to Elias. He understood that. I used to carry him in one arm. She paused. He fit in one arm. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been an intrusion. Scar's eyes were half closed in the heat, the amber irises visible as thin lines beneath the heavy lids. His tail moved once, a slow single sweep across the dirt, and then went still. The flies that had been circling the vehicle settled on the hood without interest. A hornbill landed in the nearest acacia, looked at the scene below, and departed without comment. The ordinary world continuing on around something extraordinary. It lasted 19 minutes. Elias knew because he checked his watch at the moment the lion sat down. Professional habit, documentation instinct, and he checked it again when Scar finally rose. 19 minutes of a dominant wild male lion sitting voluntarily beside a human being on open ground. Calm, unbothered, as if this were simply a thing that made sense. When Scar stood, he did it slowly. He stretched, the full extravagant stretch of a lion, spine lengthening, claws extending briefly into the dirt. And then he stood and looked at Margaret for a long moment. She looked back, or near enough, her eyes on the middle distance of his chest. He chuffed once more. That same low, soft sound. The contact call, the one with no aggression in it. Then he walked north. No hesitation, no looking back. The long grass folded around him, and the grass straightened again behind him. And then there was only the empty savanna, and the sound of Elias exhaling a breath he'd been holding for 19 minutes. Margaret didn't move for a while after that. Elias didn't rush her. When she finally turned around, her face had the quality of someone who has just returned from somewhere very far away. Not distressed, not euphoric, something quieter and more permanent than either. She looked at Elias and he looked at her, and neither of them attempted, in that moment, to explain what had just happened. The radio crackled back to life 30 minutes later. Rescue vehicle arrived in 40. On the drive back to the lodge, Elias's trainee, a 22-year-old named Sifo who had been waiting at base and knew nothing yet, asked how the afternoon had gone. Elias thought about it for a moment. Quiet, he said. It was a quiet afternoon. He didn't know how else to start. The lodge had Wi-Fi. That was the thing that struck Margaret as almost offensive when she walked back into her room that evening. The normalcy of it, the little card on the desk with the network name and password written in careful handwriting, the minibar humming in the corner, the folded towels arranged into the shape of an elephant by someone who had never stood in red dirt with their hands shaking against a car door. She sat on the edge of the bed and didn't turn on the lights. Her phone had 14 messages. Nadia had sent 3 of them. The usual check-ins, a photo of her kids at a school event. A voice note Margaret didn't play. The others were from colleagues. A journal submission reminder. Someone from the university asking about a guest lecture she'd agreed to in March. The ordinary architecture of her life waiting exactly where she'd left it. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. Outside, the bush had gone fully dark. She could hear things moving in it. Distant, unhurried. The sounds of a world that didn't organize itself around human schedules. Somewhere far to the north, something called once, and went silent. She didn't try to identify it. She just listened. She had spent 23 years in wildlife rehabilitation. She had raised orphaned cheetahs, nursed injured wild dogs, sat with a dying elephant for 6 hours because someone needed to, and she was the one who stayed. She had written in peer-reviewed language about the importance of emotional detachment in rehabilitation work, about the dangers of anthropomorphizing, about the damage that human attachment could do to an animal being prepared for a life that had no room for it. She believed all of it. She still believed all of it, and she had said his name into the open air of the Limpopo savannah, and his ear had moved. She lay back on the bed without taking off her boots and stared at the ceiling. The science was not in dispute. Olfactory memory in large felids was well documented. Lions possess a vomeronasal organ capable of encoding and retaining scent profiles with a specificity that human researchers were still working to fully map. Juvenile imprinting during critical developmental windows created associative patterns that could, under the right conditions, persist for years. The chuff vocalization was a known non-aggressive contact call used between familiar individuals. The facial rubbing was social bonding behavior. Every single thing that had happened could be explained. She knew that. She also knew that knowing it and feeling it were not the same country. What she kept returning to, what she couldn't file away into the correct academic folder and close, was the 19 minutes. Not the approach, not the vocalization, not even the facial rub against the door above her hand. The 19 minutes of him simply staying, sitting in the dirt beside her in the afternoon heat with his eyes half closed, unhurried, as if proximity to her was its own sufficient reason. She had a colleague in Pretoria, a behavioral ecologist named Dr. René Vos, who had spent 15 years studying long-term memory formation in large carnivores. Margaret had called her once years ago to ask a careful, academic, completely impersonal question about the theoretical upper limits of associative recall in juvenile imprinted phalids. Raynette had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Why are you asking me this, Maggie?" Margaret had said it was for a paper. Raynette had said, "The honest answer is, we don't know. We don't know the upper limit because we've never had enough data from controlled long-term studies. What we have are accounts, anecdotal mostly, animals returning to release sites, animals responding to former handlers after years of separation, compelling accounts that don't fit cleanly into the existing literature." She'd paused again. "The honest answer is that memory is stranger and deeper than the models we've built for it, in humans and probably in everything else." Margaret had thanked her and changed the subject. She thought about that conversation now in the dark of the lodge room while her phone screen lit up briefly with another message she didn't read. Tomorrow was her last day on the reserve. She would go on the morning drive and see whatever there was to see, and then she would fly back to Johannesburg and return to her apartment, and her guest lectures and her peer-reviewed papers and the careful, well-defended life she had built in the years since she stopped doing field work. She would not see him again. She was almost certain she would not see him again. The bush outside made its sounds, and the minibar hummed, and somewhere to the north the grass was moving in the dark, around something large and unhurried and completely, entirely wild. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. She didn't see him on the morning drive. Elias took her through the northern sector at first light, the sky going from black to purple to a pale, washed-out gold, the grass silver with dew. They drove for 2 hours. They saw a breeding herd of elephants moving through the riverbed, 3 giraffes standing motionless against the tree line like something painted there, a pair of jackals working the edge of an old kill site with brisk, businesslike efficiency. No lion. She told herself she wasn't looking. She looked anyway. By 9 o'clock the heat was already building and Elias turned the vehicle back toward the lodge without a word about it. He understood. He had understood most things without needing them explained, and she was grateful for that in a way she didn't express because there was no adequate way to. At the lodge entrance, when she climbed down from the vehicle for the last time, he handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a photograph, printed on plain paper from the lodge's office printer, slightly pixelated from the enlargement. Elias had taken it on his phone during yesterday's encounter. She hadn't noticed, hadn't thought about documentation, hadn't thought about anything except the lion and the door and the 19 minutes. The photograph showed Scar sitting in the red dirt beside the rear wheel of the Land Cruiser. Margaret was visible from the waist down, her boots, her khaki trousers, one hand flat against the door panel. The lion's eyes were half closed. His body was loose and settled. It looked to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, like a photograph of a lion resting beside a vehicle. It looked to anyone who did, like something else entirely. "For whatever it's worth," Elias said. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. The flight back to Johannesburg took an hour and 20 minutes. She sat by the window and watched the bush give way to roads, then suburbs, then the gray sprawl of the city, and she thought about what she would do with what had happened, whether she would tell anyone, whether she would write it up in some form, careful, hedged, properly qualified, or whether she would simply carry it. She thought about Rene's words, "Memory is stranger and deeper than the models we've built for it." She thought about a 6-week-old cub carried in one arm, screaming with a sound that didn't belong to anything that small. She thought about an ear rotating toward a name spoken barely above a whisper. She didn't reach any conclusions. She wasn't sure conclusions were the right thing to reach for. What she knew was this. A wild lion with no prior history of calm human contact had approached a stalled vehicle, ignored the guide, and spent 19 minutes sitting voluntarily beside a woman he had last encountered a decade ago when he was still small enough to carry. He had used vocalizations associated with familiar individuals. He had used contact behaviors associated with social bonding. He had shown none of the territorial aggression documented repeatedly in his behavioral record. And then he had stood up and walked back into his life unhurried without looking back, as if he had simply needed to confirm something, as if the confirmation once made was enough. Margaret got home at 2 in the afternoon. She fed her cat, a large, opinionated tabby named Gerald, who greeted her return with the specific indifference of an animal that has never doubted its own importance. She made tea. She stood at her kitchen window and looked at the street below for a while without seeing it. Then she went to her desk, opened her laptop, and sat there for a long moment before she started to type. She didn't write a paper. She wrote a letter. To no one. To herself, maybe. to the version of herself that had stood in a rescue tent in July of 2014 and lifted something terrified and small and alive, and made a choice to stay, every morning, until staying was no longer what he needed. She wrote, "I don't know what you remembered. I don't know if what you felt in any way resembles what I felt. I'm not sure those are even the right questions." She wrote, "But you stayed. 19 minutes. And so did I." She stopped there. Outside, Johannesburg moved through its afternoon the way cities do. Indifferent, continuous, enormous. Gerald jumped onto the desk and walked across the keyboard, and she moved him gently aside and closed the laptop without saving the document. Some things don't need to be kept to be true. The photograph stayed in her jacket pocket for a long time after that. She moved it from jacket to jacket as the seasons changed, never putting it in a drawer, never framing it, never showing it to anyone who would ask her to explain it. She just kept it close. The way you keep something that has no name yet but belongs to you anyway. There are things science can measure and things it can only gesture toward. What happened on that road in Limpopo has been described, by the few who know about it, in very different ways. A behavioral anomaly, a remarkable coincidence, an example of long-term olfactory memory activation. None of those descriptions are wrong. None of them are complete. We spend so much of our lives deciding what counts as real, what qualifies, what can be proven. But sometimes something happens in the middle of nowhere, with no audience and no agenda, and it asks you a question you haven't thought to ask yourself. What do you think an animal carries, across years and miles, and the full weight of a wild life? And what does it mean if the answer is more than we thought? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments.